Knights of Spain, Warriors of the Sun, Hernando de Soto and the South Ancients Chiefdoms, by Charles Hudson. Chapter 3, La Florida. De Soto's fleet departed from Havana Harbor on Sunday, May 18, 1539. It consisted of 9 ships, 5 large ships naus, 2 caravels, and 2 brigantines. The naus were stout, beamy vessels with a lane-to-beam ratio of about 3 to 1, and they were deep in the hold. Rigged with square mainsails, foresails, and topsails, and with a lateen mizzensail, they were designed to carry men and cargo, but they were still relatively fast. One of the nails was the worm-eaten Santa Catalina, in which Hernan Ponce de Leon had sailed into Havana Harbor. The caravel, incorporating both Iberian and Muslim nautical traditions, was crucial in the early exploration of the Atlantic. The caravel was long, with a length-to-beam ratio of 3.3 to 1, or even more. It was fast and maneuverable, and had a shallow draft so that it could venture into unknown shallow waters. It was a medium-sized vessel, typically rigged with square mainsails and foresails, and with a lateen mizzensail. The brigantine was a large open boat that was used as a service vessel. It had 1, occasionally 2 masts, and it could be propelled by oars as well as by sail. Equipped with 7 benches, more or less, and with 2 rowers to each bench, the brigantine was used for river travel and also to ferry men in freight from ship to shore. On voyages, they were ordinarily towed behind caravels and naus. A brigantine could carry 30 to 50 people in addition to its crew. De Soto's fleet enjoyed good weather and favorable winds, and on Sunday, May 25th, the feast of Espiritu Santo, they sighted a string of low, sandy islands that lay off the coast of La Florida. They anchored their fleet at about 1 or 2 leagues from shore in 4 brasas or less of water, about 22 feet. They were afraid to approach any closer for fear of shoals, reckoning that they were, at this time, due north of the island of Tortuga, which lay at the mouth of the Bahama Channel. Rangel describes their position as being 10 leagues west of the Bay of Juan Ponce, Charlotte Harbor. Presumably he meant that they were 10 leagues west of the longitude of the Charlotte Harbor. Since longitude could not be accurately measured in this era, this could have been no more than a guess, but as it turned out, a good guess. At about the same time the ships sighted land, the Indians on shore sighted these ships, and the Spaniards soon saw smoke from many fires rising above the trees, this being one of the ways the Indians signaled alarm. Evidently, Juan de Añasco did not recognize landmarks on the coast he had reconnoitered the previous winter. They were looking for a harbor that Luis Hernandez de Viedma called Bahia Honda, i.e. Bahia Honda, the Deep Bay. In order to determine better where they were, De Soto, Añasco, and Alonso Martin, the pilot for the fleet, got into a brigantine with several others and sailed toward the shore. When they came in close to the shore, Añasco still did not recognize any landmarks. Because it was getting dark, they turned around and attempted to sail back to the ships, but the wind was against them. They were forced to drop anchor near the shore. When they went ashore, they saw many indications of Indians, and then came to a village consisting of 1 large house, probably a public structure, and several small ones. Evidently, the inhabitants had run away. Those on board the ships were concerned for De Soto's safety. If he came under attack in the dark of night, they would not be able to go to his aid. As always, De Soto was long on courage, short on prudence. He was more than ready to throw himself into the middle of a situation, no matter what the danger, and in doing so perhaps raise himself in the eyes of the men under his command. Though exposing himself to injury or death, he was putting his men at risk. The next morning, May 26th, the men on the ships could see the brigantine again attempting in vain to approach them. Baltasar de Gallegos shouted to Vasco Porcallo, the lieutenant general, who was aboard the flagship, saying that he should go out and try to learn what De Soto wanted them to do. But if Porcallo heard and answered, Gallegos did not hear him. Gallegos then ordered the caravel he captained to sail out to meet the brigantine. De Soto was heartened that Gallegos had tried to help him, but he was distressed that by doing so he had put his caravel into some hazard in the shallow Gulf waters. By this time the entrance to the harbor had been located. They were anchored off the coast of Longboat Key, about 16 miles south of the entrance to Tampa Bay. De Soto ordered that Gallegos' caravel be stationed on one side of the entrance to the channel, and that the second brigantine be stationed on the opposite side of the channel. The brigantine, occupied by Añasco and him, then acted as a pilot boat, guiding the ships through the channel and into the harbor. It is likely that they used the southwest channel, which lay south of Edgemont Key and had a minimum depth of perhaps 22.5 feet. The ships were anchored at 4 or 5 leagues from the entrance. One at a time they began their entry under sail, constantly surrounding the depth because there were many shallow places in the bay. Even though they proceeded with great care, 2 of the ships scraped bottom, but because it was a slit bottom, no damage was done. De Soto had difficulty containing his anger at Añasco, whom he evidently felt had been derelict in locating a deep entrance and passage within the bay. Perhaps because the information they had on the channel into Tampa Bay was so poor, it took them 5 days to pilot the ships into the harbor, from Monday, May 26th, until Friday, May 30th, and even though they consistently sounded the lead, the ships continued to sometimes scrape the soft bottom. It is possible that as they proceeded further into the harbor, they used the brigantines rowed by the men to tow the ships in, the water being too shallow to proceed safely under sail. While this maneuver was in progress, some of the men went ashore in small boats to procure fresh water and fodder for the horses. They also brought back some wild grapes. These were not ripe enough for the men to eat, but they were nonetheless a good omen, because such grapes were not to be found in either Mexico or Peru. Impeded by the shallow water, they anchored their ships about 4 leagues from the village where they intended to land. The dominant chief of the region they were in was Osita, and the village they had picked for their camp was subject to him. De Soto had chosen to land on what was geologically the youngest part of the North American continent, the shoreline of the Florida Peninsula. In 1539, much of the shoreline of Tampa Bay was lined with stands of red mangrove or Rhizophora mangle, a tree remarkable for its ability to send out a triangle of stilted roots into the shallow salt water, figure 9. When the leaves of these trees fall into the tangle of roots in seawater, they rot to form soil and build land. Red mangrove trees grow as high as 70 feet tall, though today, because seafront land is so valuable, much of the red mangrove forest in Florida has been cleared. For De Soto, these dense stands of red mangrove trees would have been a formidable barrier to getting his men and horses ashore. The stands of these trees must have been especially dense around the estuary of the Manatee River. Fortunately, there was a stretch of mangrove-free sandy beach at present-day Piney Point, and this area was doubly attractive because it lay only about a half-mile from the channel they were following as they eased their way into the bay. From the channel, the water rapidly becomes shallow as one moves toward the shore. On May 30th, they began winching up the horses out of the holds of the ships and swimming them ashore to the beach. While the unloading of the horses was still underway, Vasco Porcallo de Figueroa, Juan de Añasco, Francisco Osorio, and 5 others went ashore and rode from the beach into the woods to see what they could see. Some of the vegetation they encountered was like that on the island of Cuba. Inland from the shoreline, and especially in the salt flats, the trees were black mangrove, and inland from these were white mangrove, as well as buttonwood, poisonwood, and other salt-tolerant plants. Vasco Porcallo, Añasco, Osorio, and the others reconnoitered the land for about a half a league around the place where they had come ashore. It is probable that Vasco Porcallo was already hunting for slaves. They chanced up some Indians who were coming to have a look at the strangers on their shore. These Indians put up a resistance, and in the fighting that ensued, 2 Indians were killed and 1 horse was killed before the remaining Indians turned and ran. The Spaniards' horses were weak from the voyage, and they became mired in the swamps and floundered in the water and mud. After they returned to camp, Vasco Porcallo's horse fell to the ground and died. It had been struck by an arrow that passed through its cloth saddle tree and pack saddle and still carried enough force that more than a third of the arrow penetrated into its rib cage. They evidently continued unloading the horses on May 31st. To further lighten their ships, they also put an unknown number of men ashore at Piney Point. Vasco Porcallo and about 100 men went ahead in the Brigantines to scout out the village where they intended to land. Gomez Arias later returned in one of the Brigantines, reporting that it was a very good country, and that the Indians had all fled from their village. Panfilo de Narvaez had been in the vicinity of Tampa Bay in 1528, and the natives thereabouts had good reason to fear and detest the Spaniards. Base Camp. On June 1st, the men who had been put ashore began marching toward the village they had selected for their base camp. Their guides were 4 of the Indians Juan de Añasco captured when he reconnoitered the coast the previous winter. The Spaniards soon lost their bearings, although it is not clear whether this was because they could not understand their guides or whether the guides were intentionally trying to mislead them. De Soto and a contingent of horsemen went ahead to scout the way, but they found it difficult going, and their horses became very tired after winding around long deer trails and slogging their way through swamps for what seemed like 12 leagues. But finally they found themselves at an inlet of the Arbor, the mouth of the Little Manatee River, which lay between them and the village selected for the landing place, the place where they would establish their base camp. The men reached the inlet at the end of a long day, exhausted, unable to cross over to the base camp without boats. That night they slept scattered about, here and there, in an undisciplined way, and would have been vulnerable had the Indians attacked. The next day they were ferried across the inlet. After the men and horses had all been put ashore, the seamen began ferrying the cargo ashore in small boats. As the ships grew lighter, they drew less water and could gradually be maneuvered closer to the landing site. The mouth of the Little Manatee River lay at about 1.5 miles from the main channel in Tampa Bay, but a lesser channel about 8 or 9 feet deep connected the main channel to the river's mouth, providing safe navigation for small boats. This unloading continued for several days. It is not possible to be precise about the number of people and horses De Soto landed in Florida, but the number of people appears to have been about 600, and the 243 horses that were loaded on the ships in Havana Harbor had been reduced by the 19 or 20 that died en route. Horses fared badly aboard ship. They were often transported by means of belly bands suspended from the roof of the hold, so their hooves were held several inches from the floor, preventing them from rearing. To native people who observed the Spaniards unloading their ships and boats, it must have been an amazing spectacle. The Spaniards brought their food and supplies ashore in wooden barrels and casks, and in large and small earthenware containers. Their clothing and other dry goods were packed in baskets and panniers. The Indians had seen these strange clothing and weapons before, when Narvaez had come. 16th century Spaniards did not wear the uniform clothing of modern armies. Rather, their clothing was individualistic and colorful. Their upper garments were doublets of cloth and leather, perhaps with fashionable slashed sleeves and rolls at the shoulders. They wore short breeches, which may have been puffed out with the stuffing. On their legs and feet they wore tight-fitting stockings. Some of them wore boots that reached to their thighs, but that were ordinarily worn rolled down to below their knees. They loved color, green, blue, black, and especially red. The footmen wore steel helmets. One popular type was the morion, a helmet that rose up to a keeled peak, with a short downturned brim that was likewise peaked in front and in back. The horsemen wore the heaviest armor, though not the full armor of the medieval knight. Riding a la jineta, they wore a helmet, a cuirass to protect their chest, abdomen, and back, and armor to protect the outsides of their arms and thighs. Some wore only shirts of chainmail and gauntlets. A shirt of chainmail could weigh as much as 15 to 30 pounds, but it was evenly distributed on the body, and on horseback one could bear it. The horseman was armed with a lance consisting of a steel point mounted on a small diameter wooden shaft, 9 to 12 feet long, and he carried a small shield made of metal or wood covered with thick leather. Footmen wore lighter armor. They wore steel helmets like the horsemen, but they were more likely to protect their bodies with sleeveless linen garments to which small steel plates, brigading, were riveted. Even lighter defensive garments were made of 2 layers of heavy cotton cloth, stuffed with 2 or 3 fingers of cotton fiber, and then quilted. Such garments could stop arrows more effectively than chainmail. Padded doublets were worn in 16th century Europe, but this attire may owe something to the Aztecs, who wore larger, looser-fitting padded garments as armor. Some of the footmen were armed only with sharp, double-edged swords and small shields. Some also carried crossbows, matchlock guns, or halberds. The latter is a polearm consisting of a long wooden handle with a steel head that could be used to impale, hack, or hook one's opponent. The Spaniards established their camp near the shore of the bay that ran inland to the village of Osita. This village was a small one, with only 7 or 8 houses, which were built of wood with roofs of thatched palm leaf. The chief or headman's house stood on a high artificial mound near the beach. On the opposite side of the town was a temple that had on top a wooden bird with gilded eyes. They found nothing of value to them in the houses or in the temple, only some pearls, which the Indians had ruined by exposing them to fire. The Indians valued these fire-marred pearls, wearing them strung about their necks and arms. The chronicler's description of the town of Osita is consistent with what archaeologists have learned about the safety harbor culture of the people who lived around Tampa Bay in the late prehistoric period. More than 100 safety harbor sites are known to archaeologists in an area of West Florida stretching from the Charlotte Harbor in the south to the Withlacoochee River in the north, but most particularly around Tampa Bay and Manatee, Hillsborough, and in Pinellas counties. The Withlacoochee River appears to have been particularly important boundary, separating safety harbor culture from cultures that lay to the north. The safety harbor people lived in clusters of small villages that were under the power of chiefs. The larger sites had temple mounds and burial mounds, and many sites had large accumulations of discarded shell, mainly oyster. Much of their food came from the Gulf and from the estuaries at the mouths of the rivers. Unfortunately, most of these shell heaps have been bulldozed in the 20th century, and the shell used to pave roads, effectively destroying many safety harbor archaeology sites. Archaeologists have thus far learned next to nothing about the houses built by the people of the safety harbor culture. Like many people in the late prehistoric Southeast, the safety harbor people practiced secondary burial. That is, when someone died, they would remove the flesh from the skeleton, and the skeleton was then bundled up in a fabric wrapping or placed in containers and then stored inside a temple or charnel house. These temples were often built on top of low mounds. Some of these remains were subsequently interred in burial mounds, perhaps reserved for particular kin groups, located out in the woods, away from the villages. Similar low and generally circular burial mounds were also built in northern Florida and along the coast of Georgia. Periodically, the temples were raised and the bundles of bones inside were buried or placed on the surface of the mound. The mound was then covered over with a layer of sand or dirt, and a new temple might then be built on top of the enlarged mound. The event that occasioned the emptying and rebuilding of a temple ossuary is unknown, though here as elsewhere, one such occasion might have been the death of an important chief. The town of Osita, where the Spaniards had established their base camp, may have been the Thomas Mound site on the north side of the mouth of the Little Manatee River. The site had a burial mound measuring 6 feet high and 60 feet in diameter, and it included an extensive horses, dogs, pigs. De Soto's men had as allies a triad of domesticated animals, horses, dogs, and pigs, that served them in peace and in war. These three animals were thoroughly integrated into Spanish life, and particularly so for Extremadurans. Horses contain a tremendous military advantage on the Spaniards, carrying goods for them and allowing them to travel farther and faster than they could have on foot, and with much less expenditure of energy. The dogs formed social bonds with the Spaniards, perhaps regarding them as dominant members of their own pack. Thus they would search out, herd, harass, or attack and kill anything their masters sent them after. The pigs, tended by swineherds and dogs, were a mobile larder for the Spaniards. The herd belonged to De Soto, who butchered them only occasionally, for feasts and at times when his men had no other source of food. The interlocking roles of these three animals in Spanish culture can be seen most dramatically in the wild boar hunt, a very popular sport among the nobility in 16th century Spain. The favorite time for a hunt was a moonlight night in autumn, when the pigs were feeding on acorns that had fallen to the ground. The hunters would go out on their horses armed with lances. They took along dogs to locate the pigs, drive them to the hunters, and worry the pigs until the hunters could ride them down and lance them. It required considerable equestrian skill, as well as bravery on the part of both rider and horse, to lance wild pigs from horseback. The horses that De Soto brought with him were probably like the barb of today, so called because they were first bred on the Barbary coast of North Africa and introduced into Spain by the Muslims. In many ways, the barb resembled modern Arabian horses. They were small horses with exceptionally hard bones and strong tendons, and they could carry heavy loads for long distances at surprisingly fast speeds. They were able to travel long distances with little sustenance, and they were famous for continuing to perform after being grievously wounded. The Spanish horse had a broad forehead and a face tapering to a small muzzle with large, flaring nostrils. It had an arched neck with a long mane and a flowing tail set high. The color was variable. De Soto started out riding a dappled gray called Aceituno, named after Mateo de Aceituno of Albana, who had given him the horse. Nuno de Tovar also rode a dappled gray. Juan Lopez Cacho rode a toasted bay with a black mane and tail. Gonzalo Silvestre, who bragged shamelessly about the virtues of his horse, rode a chestnut with a stalking left foot and a white stripe from its forehead to its muzzle. This horse, by scent only, was able to follow a trail through a swamp along which De Soto's army had passed earlier. De Soto and his men rode their horses in the a la jineta style, after the manner of Moors, with their legs slightly flexed so they could maneuver their horses better and wield their lances more effectively. In this way, they could hold the lance level alongside their thigh, parallel to the horse, or they could brace their hand against their chest for a powerful thrust. Also, they could thrust downward with their lance, and they could do so likewise with a sword. They used high Moorish sandals and Moorish bits. Not only could lancers inflict heavy casualties on Indian warriors, they could prevent them from closing in and doing hand-to-hand combat with Spanish footmen. Indians found few places to hide from the horses. If they could make it to a swamp or canebrake, they were safe. Lacking these refuges, they could try to seek cover behind a tree, but any attempt to run brought the great danger of exposing their naked backs to the lance. The Spaniards would sometimes put their men at risk in order to protect their horses. During the course of the expedition, Baltasar de Gallegos once commanded a contingent of men who were detached from the main army and were trying to catch up with them. They were slowed down when 3 of their horses became ill. The men grumbled, but Gallegos insisted that they continued their slow pace because the horses were the nerve and sinew of the army, and the Indians feared them greatly. The chronicler said the Indians were more intent on killing horses than on killing Spaniards, and when the Indians killed a horse, they were as pleased as if they had killed 3 or 4 men. The Spaniards attached quantities of small copper bells to the trappings of their horses, in the manner of sleigh bells, that jingled when their horses moved. These bells were made out of pieces of sheet copper that were individually formed and then soldered together. The bells are spherical, measuring about 1 1/4 inches in diameter. An attachment loop of copper was soldered to the top of the bell, and the lower part had a slot cut out in it, so sound from a pebble or piece of iron inside would escape freely. The Indians fancied these bells, and archaeologists, who call them Clarksdale bells, have found them in several sites in the neighborhood of the routes traveled by Narvaez, De Soto, and Luna. Perhaps the close association of these little bells with fearsome horses was part of their allure for the Indians. Well before the 16th century, Europeans had developed several breeds of large dogs that were used to herd animals, to hunt, and to do battle with and terrorize men. These were the Mastiff, a short-haired, heavily muscled dog that could withstand long marches and hold its own against wolves, and was favored in herding sheep and pigs. The swift, lean greyhound was used to hunt and attack large animals such as deer and wild boars, and it could also be trained as a war dog. A third type of dog, the Alano, was a large attack dog, evidently of several breeds, including large mastiffs and Irish wolfhounds. Such dogs were used against the Moors in the Reconquest, against the Wanches in the conquest of the Canary Islands, and quite naturally they were taken to the New World to be used against the Indians. The most vicious of these war dogs had to be chained and managed by handlers. But these fierce dogs knew the difference between Spaniard and Indian, and some of them could be sent to chase down a particular Indian. Their handlers could send them on the attack by shouting, "Tomalos, get them," while indicating who was to be the target. To make the dogs even more fearsome, the Spaniards often put spiked leather or wide steel collars around their necks, so the person under attack could not get his hands around the dog's neck to choke it. And when the dogs were exposed to Indian arrows, the Spaniards sometimes protected the dogs' bodies with escalpiles, jackets of thick quilted cotton armor. Typically, these dogs would kill by attacking a man's belly. And Juan Ortiz. De Soto and his men found themselves in a country with no advisor or informant who could tell them where anything was located. There were trails, but no one knew which ones to follow. De Soto sent out one of their captive Indian translators to establish contact with the local Indians, but evidently this man did not return. Foolishly, they did not take the precaution of chaining the other 3 translators, and during the night of June 3rd, 2 of them escaped through the carelessness of 2 soldiers who were supposed to have guarded them. The Spaniards evidently captured at least one Indian who was subject to Osita. They interrogated him, presumably using their lone remaining translator. The captive attempted to tell them about a matter that Añasco's captured translators had already told them about in a garbled way. He seemed to say that a Spaniard was living among some Indians near where their camp was. The captive kept uttering the word Orotis, which caused the Spaniards much delight, because what he was saying seemed to contain the Spanish word oro, gold, and that is all that is what they all wanted to discover. De Soto and his men were growing anxious about their lack of intelligence concerning La Florida. The land surrounding their base camp was very swampy and thickly wooded, and they had difficulty getting about. With their one remaining Indian translator and a guide unable or unwilling to tell them about the lay of the land, they were helpless to plan what to do next. On June 4th, De Soto ordered Baltasar de Gallegos to take 40 horsemen, 80 footmen, and their Indian guide and to go find a village, or short of that, to capture some people. De Soto next ordered Captain Juan Rodriguez Lobillo to take 50 footmen and go in a different direction. Lobillo had some arquebusiers and crossbowmen in this company, but most of his men were armed only with swords and shields. After crossing a swampy area impassable to horsemen, they discovered a small village near the river. When the people inside the houses spied them, they ran out and plunged into the river. The Spaniards managed to capture 4 women, but as they were returning to camp with their captives, they were pursued by 20 warriors who pressed them very hard. Without horsemen, Lobillo and his men had little, if any, advantage over the Indians. In this conflict, they realized that the Indians of La Florida would be formidable adversaries. They were extraordinarily nimble, and if the Spaniards pressed them, they would flee, but never to more than the distance of an arrow shot. But as soon as the Spaniards turned their backs, the Indians would come after them. They were constantly in motion, running from side to side, so that the arquebusiers and crossbowmen could not get a clear shot. In the time it took a crossbowman to load, aim, and shoot once, an Indian could let fly 3 or 4 arrows, and they seldom missed their mark. They managed to wound 6 of Lobillo's men, and one of them subsequently died. As for Gallegos and his contingent, they ranged about the countryside for the entire day, often confused because their guide took advantage of their ignorance of the land to lead them in circles. But when Gallegos became certain the guide was deceiving him, he threatened to kill him, and this persuaded the guide to lead them back to a trail. Near sunset, they spotted a party of 10 to 20 Indians who had painted their bodies with a red pigment they used when they wanted to make a good show. They wore tufts or bunches of feathers, penachos, on their heads, and they were armed with bows and arrows. Gallegos and his men charged at this party of Indians and lanced one of them, the others fleeing into a small forest. But one of the Indians separated from the others and brashly approached the Spaniards. As Alvaro Nieto bore down on him with his lance, the warrior adroitly knocked the lance away with his bow and leaped aside. He shouted, "Chivilla, Chivilla," which the Spaniards realized was to mean Sevilla, Sevilla. Then, to their astonishment, the man said, "Sirs, for the love of God and Saint Mary, do not kill me. I am Christian, like you, and I am a native of Seville, and my name is Juan Ortiz." He was the Ortiz their captive had told them about. His Spanish was so rusty that Gallegos and his companions could hardly understand him. He begged for the Spaniards to stop attacking his Indian comrades, some of whom had run back to their chief Mocoso with news of the encounter. At Ortiz's prompting, Gallegos sent another Indian messenger to Mocoso, informing him that the attack had been a mistake. At first appearance, Juan Ortiz was indistinguishable from his Indian comrades. He was deeply tanned by the sun. He was dressed as the Indians were dressed. He carried a bow and arrows, and his arms were tattooed just as theirs were. Because he had not spoken Spanish for 12 years, he had been held captive. He now spoke it haltingly. It was more than 4 days before he ceased mixing Indian words into his Spanish. Gradually, as he regained fluency in his native language, his story began to unfold. Not only was Ortiz a native of Seville, he was the son of a noble family. He had first come to La Florida with Narvaez, but had returned to Havana with the ships after they had unloaded Narvaez and his army. In Havana, Narvaez's wife eventually ordered Ortiz and 20 or 30 others to sail to La Florida to search for signs of the expedition. They did so, sailing into Tampa Bay to a town of Osita. On the beach, they saw stuck in the sand a stick with its upper end split and with what appeared to be a letter wedged into the cleft. Ortiz and others concluded that it had been left by Narvaez to inform them of his actions. They asked some Indians who were on the beach to bring it to them, but the Indians, by means of signs, indicated that they should come ashore and get the letter themselves. In a show of friendship, 2 Indians swam out and climbed aboard the ship. With these 2 friendly Indians as hostages, Ortiz and another crewman volunteered to go and retrieve the letter, even though the other men counseled them not to do so. As soon as the 2 Spaniards were on the beach, a great number of Indians rushed out and surrounded them. At the same instant, 2 Indian hostages dove overboard and swam underwater for a great distance before surfacing and swimming onto the shore. Ortiz's companion put up a fight and was killed on the spot. The men on the bergantin were so outnumbered they made no attempt to rescue Ortiz. Instead, they raised sail and made for the mouth of the harbor. The Indians led Ortiz to their chief, Osita. Chief Osita had good reason to hate Spaniards. A member of the Narvaez expedition had thrown the chief's wife to the dogs to be killed and devoured, and they had cut off the tip of the chief's nose, disfiguring him for life. It was said that every time the chief went to blow his nose, he would remember that Ortiz was his captive. He condemned Ortiz to performing the most menial tasks, carrying water and firewood, which he was required to do unceasingly. When the chief became particularly irritable, he would make Ortiz run back and forth across the plaza of the town for long periods of time. If he tried to stop running, the chief's men would shoot arrows at him. Ortiz's suffering was so great, he sometimes envied his companion, who had been killed on the beach. Finally, Chief Osita decided to put Ortiz to death by torture. He ordered that a great fire be built in the plaza. When he had burned down to coals, the Indians raked the coals under a grill, suspended on posts about 3 feet high. They bound Ortiz hand and foot and tied him to the grill. But when Ortiz began shrieking, the wife and daughters of the chief begged that his life be spared. They argued that Ortiz had not been with those who had perpetrated the crimes against Osita. And how could a single boy be any threat to the people of Osita? Moreover, alive, they had the benefit of his service as a slave. The chief relented. Ortiz had already been badly burned by the coals. Huge blisters on his body became raw and bloody, and some later became infected with maggots. One entire side of his body became a solid scar. The chief's wife and her daughters nursed him back to health using herbal remedies. When he had recovered his health, he was given the job of guarding the temple at night. Cadavers were stored in this temple, and wolves and other scavengers would sometimes come at night to try to eat the remains. The chief warned Ortiz that if even a part of a body was devoured by an animal, he would roast him for certain. The chief gave Ortiz some javelins to use against scavengers. One night, Ortiz dozed off while on watch. He awoke to the sound of some boards being toppled from a sepulchre, and he thought at that moment that he was as good as dead. A wolf had entered the temple and had dragged out the body of the son of one of the principal men in the town. Ortiz followed a trail for a distance until he heard the sound of an animal gnawing on bones. He threw a javelin into the darkness in the direction of the sound. Though it was too dark to see if he had hit his mark, he was somewhat encouraged because he did not hear the beast flee, and also because his throwing hand was salty, this being a good sign when one had to make a throw in the dark. He returned to the temple to pray while waiting for the sun to rise. In the first light, he saw that the boy's body was missing and became depressed, knowing what the consequences would be. When Chief Osita learned what had happened, he resolved to execute Ortiz. But when Osita sent a party of men to examine the trail where the wolf had gone, they found the body of the boy, and a little further on they found the wolf dead of a wound from Ortiz's javelin. This lucky throw of the javelin was impressive to Chief Osita and his people, and because of this their estimation of Ortiz rose. Thereafter they treated him with respect. Ortiz enjoyed this good favor for about 3 years until Osita was attacked by his enemy Mocoso, whose territory was 2 days distant. As a consequence of those hostilities, Osita and his people had to flee to a tributary town located on another inlet. For unknown reasons, this attack undercut Ortiz's good standing. He learned from one of the same girls who had saved his life that the chief had decided to sacrifice Ortiz the very next day. She told him he should flee to Mocoso, where he would be safe, because she had heard that Mocoso wished to have Ortiz as a subject. Ortiz did not know how to find his way to the territory of Mocoso, but the girl offered to help, and that night she led him half a league from the town and put him on the right trail. In order to keep their absence from being discovered, she then returned to the town, presumably after giving Ortiz instructions on how to proceed from there. Ortiz traveled all night through the darkness, and the next morning he came to the river, the Alafia, that lay on the boundary of Mocoso's territory. 2 Indians were fishing on the river. Since they were enemies of Osita, and since the languages of Osita and Mocoso were mutually unintelligible, Ortiz was afraid that if they saw him, he would not be able to explain to them who he was. Northward from Tampa Bay. After unloading, the large ships returned to Cuba and the smaller ones remained at Tampa Bay for further service. The leaders of the expedition discussed what to do next. The place where they had landed did not seem to be a good place to found a settlement. The soil was too barren, and this may mean that from their point of view that there were no suitable food-producing native societies to exploit. The prevailing soils around Tampa Bay and in much of Florida are sandy grade and black flatwood soils. They are poorly drained, very acidic, and low in native fertility. The water table is typically quite near the surface. De Soto decided the time had come to look further afield. On June 20th, he sent Baltasar de Gallegos with 80 horsemen and 100 footmen to Uriparcochi. Their task was to assess the nature of the land and the people, to acquire intelligence about the land that lay beyond, and to report on what they had learned via messengers. De Soto ordered some of the remaining ships to return to Havana with orders to bring back more provisions at a specified time. Meanwhile, the Indians of Osita continued harassing and waging war on the Spaniards. In one raid, they captured a man named Grajales, but later, in a daring raid on an Osita sanctuary in a vast canebrake, the Spaniards rescued Grajales. The Indians had already dressed him as one of their own. In contrast to the way in which Ortiz had been treated, Grajales claimed to have been treated well. Perhaps the Indians wanted to gain intelligence from him or to use him as a bargaining chip. One day, De Soto received intelligence that Chief Irihigua and his warriors were encamped not far from the base camp. He sent Juan de Añasco and some foot soldiers in the ships' boats along the shore to locate and disperse them. When Añasco found him on an island, a battle ensued. Añasco used a small piece of artillery, probably a swivel gun, that was on one of the boats to kill and wound 10 of these Indians. But the Indians inflicted a similar number of casualties on the Spaniards. Añasco was not able to drive them from the island, so he sent Johan de Vega back to request that a detachment of horsemen be sent to the place where he expected the Indians to flee. Vasco Porcallo came with 40 horsemen and some foot soldiers, but by the time he got there, the Indians had already escaped. Vasco Porcallo thought this would be a good opportunity to acquire some slaves, this being one of his principal reasons for coming on the expedition. He recruited some of his horsemen and foot soldiers, and they set out. Going along, they came to a particularly bad swamp, and Vasco Porcallo, to set an example for his men, spurred his horse into the swamp. But after taking only a few steps, his horse slipped and fell into the mud and slimy water. Vasco Porcallo was at risk of drowning, but his men were afraid to plunge in after him for fear they themselves would end up in the same predicament. Vasco Porcallo was wearing a full suit of armor, and one of his legs was pinned beneath his horse. With much effort, his men finally extricated him from the mud. The slave raiding party only managed to capture a few women before heading back to camp, and Vasco Porcallo was in a dark mood. He realized he had bet a small fortune on a venture that was beginning to seem unsure of success, and even worse, he was beginning to realize he was no longer the man he had once been. On the way back to camp, he muttered to himself, and sometimes he talked aloud. He would repeat the names of the two chiefs, Irihigua and Uriparcochi, breaking up these syllables of their names and interspersing Spanish swear words. Huri hari huri higa bura koha huri hari. May the devil take the land, where the first and most continuously spoken names I have heard are so vile and infamous. Burakoha refers to a lame she-ass, and Higa refers to an amulet of a human hand with the thumb held between the fingers, worn to ward off evil. Vasco Porcallo repeated this and other obscenities many times on his way back to camp. When Vasco Porcallo got back to camp, he and De Soto exchanged angry words. Vasco Porcallo was frustrated at not being able to capture more slaves, and the character of the land did not look promising to him. He decided to return to Cuba and to take with him all the slaves and servants he had brought with him. He left behind the food he had brought, including the herd of hogs. He also gave some promise to give assistance to De Soto in the future if it should become necessary to do so. Gomez Juarez de Figueroa, the bastard son of Vasco Porcallo, had sired with an Indian girl, remained with the expedition. Vasco Porcallo supplied him with 2 horses, arms, and other supplies. Gomez Juarez was a fine soldier, but he was excessively proud. Later, when Indians killed both of his horses, De Soto offered to help him out, but he was too proud to accept help from anyone. Baltasar de Gallegos and his detachment reached the land of Uriparcochi in due time. Juan Ortiz went along as translator and guide. They first stopped at Mokoso and asked the chief to go with them to Uriparakoshi, but he declined, saying that he did not want to direct strangers to a land of a brother and an in-law. He did not want to be on the outs with Uriparakoshi, but after some persuasion, he picked one of his men who had been a friend of Ortiz to serve as an emissary and sent him out in advance of the Spaniards. When they reached Uriparakoshi's land, it is not clear that they ever reached his principal town. The chief and all his people had fled, but the chief sent 30 men to meet with the Spaniards. Gallegos asked that the chief come and speak to him in person. The Indians took this message back to the chief and then returned to say the chief was ill and could not come. They asked Gallegos about his motives. What did he want? Gallegos asked where he might find a rich land. The Indians told him of a fabulous province, Ocale, which lay to the west of where they were, and they told him many marvelous stories about Ocale. But they were so fantastic that Gallegos suspected them of lying to him as a way of persuading him to leave their land. He was afraid that if he let them go, he would never see them again. So he seized them and put them in chains. Then he sent 8 horsemen back to De Soto with letters reporting what he had learned. This concludes Chapter 3.